Yeah, thanks everyone for coming to our keynote opening speech of the MPD program 22-23. It's a tradition in the program towards the end of November to always invite somebody to talk on issues which may be close to our master's program. And this year we have with us Noelia Igareda González from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Noelia is Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Law at the UAB. I'm just going to read you a couple more of her posts. Co-Director of the Postgraduate Program in Gender and Equality and the Postgraduate Program Violencias Masclistas. Sexist Violence at the UAB. She's also coordinates the area of philosophy of law at the university and is the Vice Dean of Internationalization, Mobility at the faculty. Her main research interests are gender and law, bioethics, feminism, and feminist legal jurisprudence. And if you go onto the website of the Antigona group at the UAB, for example, you can find everything that she's published there. So I'll just repeat her name for you once again, Noelia Igareda, if you want to check her out online. And there's a huge amount of publications, and it's published in 2022, precisely on the subject that we're going to talk about today, which is anti-gender hate speech on social media. So our idea here is that Noelia is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to any questions. So please take advantage and ask any question that you might like to on hate speech, anti-gender hate speech on social media. So without further ado, as we say in English, please take the floor.
Thank you for the presentation, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this keynote lecture in this master. It's really a privilege. I would like, first of all, to say, as you have listened, I'm a legal scholar, so I'm coming here with all the cautions and because I'm not really an expert in some of the things you are studying in this master, but I think I've been invited here because I was the coordinator of a European-funded project on anti-gender hate speech on social networks, especially conducted by far-right political parties around Europe. And this has led to my interest in what happens on internet and social networks, because internet and social networks are an important part of our lives, if it's not even more important of this offline context. This is a place where we communicate to each other, where we work, where we get information, and also where it's in a space where we implement and exercise our rights. And as a legal scholar, I was really interested in how this hate speech, this anti-gender hate speech was legally approached in different countries, and how this anti-gender hate speech was sometimes a severe violation of our human rights, and how this anti-gender hate speech was related to the freedom of expression in our countries. And that was also the thing that I'm going to try to explain today. First of all, I will share with you some definitions of what we understand by anti-gender hate speech, and some numbers about the prevalence, or the calculated estimated prevalence of this phenomenon. The anti-gender hate speech is a form of violence against women that attack women in general, or attack certain groups of women, the feminists, the ones belonging to certain political party, or they attack individual women, because they are prominent politicians, because they are activists, even because they are gamers or journalists or so, or they attack persons because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. This anti-gender hate speech is legally considered in most of our countries a problem of limits to the freedom of expression. Sometimes it is recognized as a form of a hate crime, but very rarely it is considered a form of gender-based violence. It is officially recognized at international level, for example, in the CEDAW Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Istanbul Convention at European level, or other different official documents under the UN system. This gender-based cyber violence is a form of gender-based violence and is any act of gender-based violence that is committed, assisted, or aggravated in part or in full by the use of new technologies, such as mobile phones, smartphones, internet, social media platform, or email, against a woman because she's a woman, or affects women disproportionately, or against LGBT people because of their gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics, and results in physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm, including threats to carry out such acts, coercion, or deprivation in liberty in public or private life. If I give you some numbers about what is the estimated prevalence of this phenomenon, I will give you two major surveys that have been conducted at European level and also at world level. There was a survey financed by the European Union and published in 2014 that found out that an average across all the member states of the European Union was that 11% of women had experienced online abuse beginning at the age of 15. And that percentage distinguished from 5% in Romania to 18% in Sweden and Denmark, reflecting the higher numbers of internet users in these countries. But there was also a study published by Amnesty International in 2017, found that 21 of women across several countries have experienced some kind of abuse, and this went up to 37% among women between ages of 18 and 24. So we're talking about something much more prevalent than what we are aware. Journalists are often victims of hate speech on social media, and as a result may hesitate to engage in public debate or tackle certain topics. It is true that hate speech is directed to all journalists, but the statistics demonstrate that female journalists are subject to more threats than their male counterparts, in particular in the form of online harassment, threats of rape or murder, as well as incitement to hate based on the grounds of gender. These attacks sometimes are the result of orchestrated campaigns aimed at silencing these female journalists. What is the relationship between this hate speech and hate crimes? Because sometimes it's very much, it's also an object of controversy if hate crimes are going to produce at mid and long-term hate speech is going to produce at mid and long-term hate crimes. Most of the authors say that this could be represented in a sort of ladder of harm, started from acts that, like for example, bullying, ridiculization, dehumanization, and discrimination, moving towards more motivated violence, such as murder, rape, assault, terrorism, violent extremism, even genocide. So there is a clear relationship between this hate speech that may conclude, provoke, or produce at mid or long-term hate crimes. What is the relationship between this anti-gender hate speech and the so-called anti-gender movement? There's this anti-genderism is a coherent ideological construction used specifically by right-wing and religious fundamentalists worldwide they frequently use the term gender, gender ideology, or even the ideology of gender that has replaced in many of our countries the term feminism, criticizing the gender equality movements as something bad that questions the pillar of our societies and our cultures. There is obviously a religious connection between this anti-gender movement and this but it is true that it is much more than a religious reactionary answer. It started with the Catholic Church, but also evangelical and Orthodox Christians, as well as some Muslims, are also involved and have participated. It is better to understand this anti-genderism as a political rather than a religious movement, even if there are some things in common. What differentiates this anti-gender movement from some of these extreme religious fundamentalists is that the anti-gender movement rejects the use of violence and views itself as a defender of democracy in its original and true form. The original discourse of this anti-genderism was elaborated by the Catholic Church in the mid-90s as a response to the recognition of sexual and reproductive rights in the UN rights system at the 1994 UN Conference on Population and Development in El Cairo, and also the UN Conference on Women's Rights in Beijing in 1995. At that time, the Catholic Church attempted to oppose to the notion of gender because it feared that it will become, along with the institutionalization of sexual and reproductive rights, a tool for the international recognition of abortion, additional attacks on traditional motherhood, and a legitimization of homosexuality. But as I say, it is probably this anti-genderism has connection at first with these religious movements, but then it goes beyond. The ideological core of anti-genderism is a set of convictions about the nature of man, the natural law, and the human dignity consistent with Christian dogma, and radically against this understanding of gender as a social construction. Although the base is theological, a much care is taken to provide scientific background for these anti-gender views of sex differences from neuropsychology, brain sex, etc. And they have made efforts to argue that gender studies are scientifically fake. What does it mean? I mean, gender studies have, for example, demonstrated and put a lot of efforts to say that sex is biology, although now there is a whole wave of feminists that even questions that biological determination of sex, that gender is socially constructed and therefore it can be modified. And it also has challenged gender roles and gender stereotypes that maintain a patriarchal society. And it also has challenged the natural family as only an heterosexual couple with kids. But the anti-genderist movement claims to return to the natural distinction between women and men as the only distinction that can be possible, and also claims to return to the natural family where the different roles assigned both to women and men are complementary and essential for the maintenance of the institution of the family. So, as I say, anti-genderism is a political project. It is not only an analytical frame, but also a political strategy. As such, it should not only be read as a reaction to social transformation, but also as a political project. The current right-wing populist wave has contributed to the success of these anti-gender campaigns all around the world. The present wave of resistance involves new forms of organization and discourse, which allows conservative actors to reach beyond their traditional circles and connect with a wider audience. And this is where social networks and internet play a key role. Because anti-gender activists are extremely active on the web and take advantage of the possibilities offered by the new information and communication technologies. Their online activities are multidimensional and go far beyond a mere informative function. Before coming here, I was talking with the director of the master, how these far-right political parties that are that have embraced very much this anti-gender movement, why they have such a good connection with young people. And probably the key is because they know how to use social networks. I mean, they use internet and social networks as main sources of communication to spread and to disseminate their messages. They criticize the traditional mass media as old-fashioned and in the hands of the corrupted political elite. Young people do not read traditional mass media. We are completely aware. They get informed through social networks mainly. So if these political parties, they transform very complex current problems in our societies in very simple diagnosis: immigration, capitalism, individualism, and they do not only analyze those very complex problems into very simple terms. What they do also, and they use the social networks to do so, it is they provide very easy and simple solutions. Family, nation, God, and homeland, And these results very, even if at first we would think completely different, these messages arrive to the young people very easily because they find those messages even more progressive, so to say, or even more revolutionary than the traditional messages that were published or transmitted in the traditional mass media. Third question that I think is important for you, which is the relationship between this anti-gender hate speech, the hate speech in general, and the freedom of expression. I mean, freedom of expression is one of the most important human rights, and it constitutes a basic pillar of our democracies and our rules of law. The hate speech started to be a problem after World War II, when it was progressively considered a crime in some countries, when it was a racist propaganda or the denial of the Holocaust. But how is hate speech defined, for example, at UN level? They say any kind of communication in a speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or a group on the basis on who they are, in other words, based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. But yeah, that represents a challenge because we have the freedom of expression on one hand and this hate speech on the other hand that may violate some of the human rights that we are talking. So how is this solved in our countries? We might identify two major legal approaches to freedom of expression and its potential relationship to hate speech. On one hand, we find the US model and the countries that follow that model, where freedom of expression is understood as a negative freedom that demands the state non-interference position, a neutral state. It corresponds to an absolutist understanding of freedom of expression, the preferred freedom of the preferred freedoms, right? Democracy protects even those ones that deny democracy. On the other hand, we have the European model and the countries that follow that model, where freedom of expression is understood as a positive freedom within the framework of a militant democracy. What does it mean, a militant democracy? Where we expect the state to fight for democracy and to actively protect the rights and values that permit democracy. But here, the state is the protector of the public debate, and that may allow the withdrawal of certain speeches from the free market of ideas. It is important to underline the difference between freedom of expression and freedom of information. Because freedom of information, it is that where information requires a proof of certainty. Meanwhile, freedom of expression might contain lies or fake news, and still it will be an exercise or a fundamental freedom. Okay, what is the role played by social network here? As you know, internet, it's not a new form of communication. We talk still about new form. For them, is the form of communication and has also an impact on those hate speeches. Internet is transnational. It goes beyond the legal frameworks of the countries with no censorship to its users. And its universality and popularity offers new opportunities also to commit crimes. There are two moments on internet evolution especially interesting for this hate speech. At first, the birth of the World Wide Web was an extraordinary tool to disseminate information at global level. The concern here was quantitative, the potentiality of internet to disseminate violent or hateful content to millions of people. But then the evolution towards the Web 2.0 and the development of social networks make internet a very popular context of personal and social communication. So the concerns here becomes qualitative because the negative effects that disinformation may provoke when coming through internet. We have to remember that social networks belong to private companies that look for economic profit. They are not NGOs. They are not public authorities, nor governments. And we have to remember that hate speech generates more replies, more comments, more tweets, more shares of these messages. And this increases activity on internet, and it promotes more publicity, and it generates more economic income for those companies who own those social platforms. So these companies have no interest at all in putting limits to these hateful contents unless national or international governments oblige them to do so. Still, these social platforms have created certain self-regulations to put certain limits to this hate message that might be considered a violation of human rights. But in doing so, they have coined their own definition of what is hate speech that does not necessarily correspond to the national or international legal definitions. Examples of that could be the community standards of Facebook, or the rules on policies of Twitter, or the community guide of YouTube. And still, there is no transparency on how the algorithms work in these social networks, if they directly or indirectly promote the dissemination of these hateful messages. It is also known that there are some moderators somewhere that withdraw certain hate speeches on the social networks, but we don't know who they are, how they work, where they come from, which are the rules they follow to control these hate speeches on the social networks. And then what has in particular this anti-gender hate speech on social networks? I mean, anti-gender hate speech reproduces discrimination, inequality, and violence against women through insults and threats in the internet. And also, anti-gender hate speech constitutes a form of digital gender violence even in most of our countries, are still reluctant to recognize this digital violence as a form of violence against women. And it has three major consequences. It is a mechanism of correction for those women that transgress the gender roles. It is also a mechanism of reinforcement of hegemonic masculinity on the internet. And it is also a mechanism to control political participation of women in a general sense, both at the individual and collective level. It is true that this digital gender violence has not invented this form of violence, but it has specific characteristics that we have to remember in order to assess the impact and the damages that they produce. Because that violence most of the times takes advantage of the anonymity on the social networks that promotes impunity. It also takes advantage of the replicability that multiplies the number and visibility of these hateful messages. Also, the rooming, the exposition of the message through different platforms, and the permanence of these hateful messages on the social networks, they re-victimize once and again the women or the person that they were attacking. As I say, anti-gender hate speech is a corrective mechanism. It puts in place those women that transgress the expected gender stereotypes and roles. And the main consequence is the silence. After these attacks, women limit their participation on internet and they disappear completely. I always put this example to my students. What would you prefer as a punishment? To be completely away from any internet connection, any social platform, to be completely offline during 1 month of your lives, with the consequences that will have for your personal, professional, and academic life? Or would you prefer to be 1 month in a prison, but with internet connection? And my students have doubts. They say, I will have, but Wi-Fi will be okay, we'll have my PlayStation there. So 1 month, it goes really fast, because they cannot imagine 1 month of their lives with no internet connection, with no smartphone. They don't know how to make friends, make appointments, do their homework or whatever. They feel themselves completely helpless. Think about it. So if one of the major consequences of this anti-gender hate speech is that you disappear from the internet and social networks, that means more or less that you're dying digitally. And dying digitally nowadays is a major price that you have to pay, to be a victim of that. Think about that, you will see. It is true that this hate speech is also directed to men, but obviously in a less number. And also its effects are different. And they are mostly they attack men to reproach when their behavior does not meet the expected gender roles and stereotypes as men. These attacks label their acts as feminine, inferior, or disrespectfully. It is true that we normally distinguish the online world from the offline world as two separate spaces that they do not have anything in common. But it is not true. When women suffer these hate speeches on the web, we do not think that these effects will transcend to the real world and in a very multiplied effect. Which are the consequences also on their political rights? This type of violence has consequences on the victims' lives, but also, on psychological level, physical level, but also it has impacts on their participation in the social network that, as I said before, it constitutes nowadays a privileged political arena. This violence violates their freedom of expression and also other rights of political participation. it is a growing problem for women everywhere, and posing, as I say, a serious threat to the freedom of expression, but also in many cases their ability to earn a living. Sometimes it's called economic vandalism, even. And I'm going to underline a type of consequence that it is not very nice to underline, but it could be controversial, and probably afterwards some of you might disagree, but it's sometimes also put into relation that one of the consequences of this anti-gender hate speech, it is the reinforcement of the culture of rape present in our societies. I mean, it contributes to the reinforcement of gender violence or violence against women. If we understand gender violence, the type of violence that affects disproportionately to women, and it is exercised because of their gender. The under-gender hate speech contributes with its language to a socialization in values where women are perceived as inferiors and men's properties. It is demonstrated that men that are socialized in these values have more possibilities to become batterers or sexual perpetrators in the future. The culture of rape refers to this objectivization process in our society that encourages men in one way or another to sexually attack women and contributes to the normalization of sexual violence. And I'm about to finish, but I want to say some words about this men's sphere that some of you may be familiar. I mean, the men's sphere is a term used to name the different virtual spaces that accommodate very heterogeneous masculinist movement based on the dissemination of this anti-feminist and anti-gender hate speech. Despite the diversity, I'm going to list some of this movement, and some of them, I'm sure they are familiar to some of you because they have more visibility. The so-called MGTOW, men who go their own way, or men's rights activists, or the incels, the involuntary celibates. There is a worldwide movement. Or the PUAs, the pickup artists. I mean, the ones who meet to share tricks to flirt and pick up. All these groups share an anti-feminist ideology based on in-victimization discourse where feminists and its public policies criminalize men. So this discourse is accompanied with a narrative of male suffering associated to a loss of rights and longing for the old times organized around a traditional gender system. Another contribution of these groups that probably is familiar for you is the idea that violence does not have gender, that this theory justifies the male victimization, the false accusations, the battered men, and those parents fighting for young custody. They say violence is intimate, familiar, domestic, but not gender, nature. These slogans are repeated endlessly in the different mansphere communities. This is the case, for example, in Spain of Foro Coches, Ispachan, or Facebook groups that await participants and followers with small pills. Let's see all the metaphor of Netflix, to see gender relations from a real point of view and not from the point of view that feminists or gender theories are trying to convince. And also an important role is also played by video platforms and other social platforms as YouTube or Twitch, where men can find guides on how to think about the news, how to interpret the news, or to provide them with arguments that put an end to their discomforts. And finally, and I know you are not interested in that, but since I'm a legal scholar, I have to at least give some, just some lines about which are the major legal responses in our countries to this anti-gender hate speech. I'm going to use a philosopher, because at the end I'm a philosopher of law. So Iris Myron Young, that was a great philosopher, say that racism sexism, homophobia, and discrimination on the grounds of age or disability provoke behaviors, images, and stereotypes that are generalized, systematic, and they reinforce each other. It is only possible to change those habits if individuals are first aware of their individual habits and want to change them. She called it cultural revolution. But also, this philosopher considered that these changes can be facilitated also when the law punishes certain acts or implement certain public policies. The law can be also a mechanism to allow individuals to be aware of their discrimination to these social groups. Punishing this hate speech constitutes not only a question of empowerment for these minorities, but a rule of democracy and a limit to sometimes a dangerous pluralism or badly understood. I mean, regulating the language of hate is based, and this is very important, in the idea that sometimes it's necessary to silence some voices in order to listen to the others, or to be able to listen to the others. Punishing this hate speech is not because of the lies that these discourses may include. The aim is to avoid the damages that these lies can inflict in others' rights or public goods. This is what is important here. I'm going to give you the example of Spain, but probably it is the case of many of your countries. In Spain, hate speech, it is considered a form of hate crime, and in Article 510 of the Spanish Criminal Code, it says so. But it is not considered, it is considered a crime not only expressing these respectful ideas, but when these ideas can promote hate, hostility, discrimination, or violence to some groups on the grounds of race, sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, or opinion. But the problem is that this crime is orientated to protect vulnerable groups in society as religious minorities, ethnic minorities, or so. Women are not considered a vulnerable group in our society. Sexism is quite normalized. Insulting women on the social networks, threatening women on the social networks, it is something like a normal side effect or an expected side effect of the exercise of this freedom of expression. Therefore, the criminalization of this hate speech does not cover anti-gender hate speech. And we can very rarely find legal tools to put a limit to those speeches that probably you have found in your lives very frequently on the social networks. And I think this is my introduction to the course. I hope it has been interesting for you, and I'm ready to answer or to try to answer your questions or your disagreement. That is always good to have disagreement in the room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect.
Oh, yeah, good.
Well, that was wide-ranging, and I'm sure it's given us the option to ask questions of all types. Myself have three pages here, but that's not the end. So does anybody like to ask a question to Donna? Anyone you like? Yeah, there's a hand at the back. Well, that's one question. Okay.
Okay. It is what you say. I mean, our countries are much more in this point of view. Freedom of expression is one of the most important fundamental rights, therefore non-interference by the state. And unless they dearly attack a social group and they understand dearly attack, there is an imminent and violent attack to that group. If that is the case, that will be the only situation where it will be allowed to put a limit to the freedom of expression, right? And this is, as I say, very much the model that it was a little bit created by the US, and it was followed by many countries around the world. The exception was some European countries that were basically Germany, Austria, and other countries that had their very specific history after World War II. And they created legal limits to this hate speech when they are directed to ethnic minorities, anti-Semitism, or the denial of the Holocaust. But if not, freedom of expression prevails. And as you say, most of the times it is true, there are no, these hate discourses are not something welcome by the countries and by the states, but the answer will be the state should promote a counter speech as the only way. Instead of putting a limit to the freedom of expression, the only thing that the states can do, it is to promote a counter speech for those groups, population that have been attacked in order to defend themselves in front of those hate speech. But then there is also a critique of the possibility of this anti-gender, because I think I've tried to emphasize that one of the major consequences of this anti-gender hate speech is that they expel women from the political arena or from the internet or social networks that now constitute our political arena. So therefore, how can I implement any type of counter discourse if I'm outside the political arena? So I think these ideas probably well okay for Western societies after World War II, but they are not, I mean, internet and social platforms have made this a completely different context. I don't know if I have answered your idea.
Monica.
Yeah, many because how do I explain very simple things? Because it's a very complex question. Yeah, it's true. And in my speech, sometimes I was on purpose. Sometimes I was talking about anti-gender hate speech. Sometimes I was talking about digital gender violence. Sometimes I was talking about cyber gender violence, you know. Why? Because on theoretical basis, I really agree with you that is a violence exercise against people on behalf of their gender. Gender understood in a more broad sense as you posed. But what happens is our legal instruments do not recognize that type of violence as gender violence. Our legal instruments recognize as gender violence only the violence that is exercised against women because they are women, right? And there are a lot of controversies in our countries in recognizes this other violence that you are saying, I mean, violence because of my gender identity, my sexual orientation, or my gender expression as forms of gender violence. It is not recognized at all. Yes, some few countries recognize the discrimination against gender identity or gender expression, but discrimination, no violence. That is much different in legal terms. So that's why sometimes I use that, because at least at international level, we have certain consensus that this anti-gender hate speech constitutes a form of violence against women, right? Yeah, it's a pragmatical reference because of our legal state of art. It is. But yeah, I was the first one that I was quite shocked. But if you young people, do you normally read mass media, the traditional newspapers? Do you watch TV news? No, be frank, no. How do you get informed? How do you, basically, I always make jokes with my students at undergraduate students, because I make references to something that has happened that week, apart from the World Cup, Football Cup, but any other thing that happens, many other things apart from the soccer matches. They look at me like, what are you talking about? I say, it didn't appear on TikTok, so it doesn't exist for you, right? Okay, so if those far-right parties and movements use social platforms to disseminate, it's much more it's much easier that those messages will arrive to you as young people that if it is through the traditional mass media. And also, you are studying, you know much more than me in that. They work these chamber filters, or filter chambers is called. I mean, where you receive the type of information that you want to receive. And yeah, filter chambers, right? And it reproduces once again. So there is a whole, I mean, how, for example, in Spain, I mean, I don't know if you are aware that we have a very important far-right political party that is voted by young people also. No, only very young people. There is a group of people here, young people that meet in some cities of the country, Cañas for España. I mean, it's like, let's go beers for Spain. And they do meetings, to reinforce their things. So it's a language that is very much connected to young people. As I say, it's very simple. If all the problems that I have, young unemployment, the collapse of the welfare state, things that are very complex, if are presented in a very simple ways, will you listen or read or see a TikTok video, or will you read a manifesto of 10 pages by some whatever communist party that talks with languages from the 19th century? Yeah, I mean, we were talking, I mean, at least my students also will not see a video that lasts more than 30 seconds. Even when you send audios to each other, if your friend sends you an audio that lasts more than 1 minute, you put in double the speed, yeah? Because, I mean, yeah, you are expecting communication in a completely other way. Those movements know it, and they use it to connect to the young people, yeah? Both. I mean, I think it's a mix of everything. I'm using the type of communication that will connect to you, and is the only channel of communication that you use and consume. Plus, I'm using a language that is the one that you understand. Plus, I'm sending you messages, very simple, that give you solutions, that give you a lot of peace. Because everything is solved in homeland, God, and family. That relaxes me a lot, I mean, that gives me a lot of peace to understand society and problems and, weather, climate changes and things like that. I mean, I'm not an expert in political communication, so I don't know. Yeah, I'm only aware of the diagnosis. I say that, probably some people here in this room have a better knowledge of what happens or what should be done by the other political parties that are, I mean, that sometimes this, in fact, probably you are aware that this anti-gender hate speech is very much directed to female politicians from those countries. I mean, those of you who are Spaniards probably are very familiar. There is a very organized political campaigns that precisely attack those women belonging to those political parties. But I think your professor will have a better answer to that, no?
I had the same question.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just thinking about what's happened to Pedro
Yeah.
in the last 2 weeks, or what's happened to Pedro Sanchez's wife,
Yeah.
or what's happened to
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I put an example. I mean, probably you also have the same experience. I belong to some feminist groups that from time to time they send you a manifesto or some type of document, and they ask you if you want to sign it. And when I receive those documents, I say, well, what a boring thing. I myself, I'm not going to read that 10 pages manifesto, sign it. No one is going to read ever the manifesto if that is trying to have any impact in the public opinion. If that is a reaction or a complaint against something that has happened, And I'm the first one that I see that the type of communication and political engagement that we use belongs to other century. Then does not have any political impact, I'm afraid. And when I try to be critical about those political groups that I belong to, I'm not very welcome, From my point of view, I'm not an expert, but from my point of view, I don't think it is a question that female journalists or female activists or do have they do not manage the good language, or they do use a very complex language. I think it's their presence in those social networks or in internet or in this mass media. You see, one of the consequences of this anti-gender hate speech, it is women, withdraw from the internet, women withdraw from the social networks, you disappear. You see, you are much more aware and you know much better the percentage of female journalists in our mass media and also on the social networks is still very low, right? I mean, even all those studies who analyze the weight of women on the news, the weight of women as journalists, or even on the topics, internet. I mean, all those analyses of how women produce content on internet, on the social platforms, it's really a minimum percentage of who are the authors of those contents. I have a very clear idea because most of those reflections come from this project I explained, that I remember having the experience of a female gamer, who was like superstar gamer and who was organizing gaming competitions only for women. And she was the victim of very violent attacks on the internet, questioning and that she was organizing a gaming championship only for women. And it was so much that she was threatened, that they were going to kill her if she was still in her attempt to organize a gaming championship only for women here in the city of Barcelona, I remember. And she finally abandoned the idea. I'm not going to put in risk my life to be present in this world where it's really, female gamers, we represent less than 5%. I'm talking about, I'm not an expert of the gaming world, but I know, women are anecdotic in this world. They represent 1 or 2% of all these famous gamers. And she was still very famous. And she withdrew from the attempt. She was like, I'm not putting a risk. And I think that was a symbol why they are expelled from those spaces. Not that their language is not the adequate one, because they are not that. Simply, they do not have a space or opportunity to send their messages. Yeah, but I don't want to be misunderstood. But when I talk about this, I never talk about women against men or men against women. And I'm always aware that women and men, we are socialized in the same society with the same gender roles and stereotypes. So I'm very much in favor of the female quotas and positive action, but still the mere presence of women does not make things equal, right? For example, in my field, sometimes people are very angry because when we analyze how a court or a tribunal rules a sentence very sexist, and people say, how can a judge be so sexist? And I say, a judge is a person like us, He's a man or a woman who comes from these classrooms, and he or she have been educated in the same gender stereotypes that we do. Judges are no asexual angels that fly over the earth, even if some of them think so. There are people like us who have been educated in the same way as we, So, the fact that women can be in these positions and still reproduce those, discriminatory and even anti-gender messages. Yeah, it is true. Yeah. It is a proposal or a question? That you, if it's possible to have a legal response that goes beyond punishing and tries to look for a more restorative approach. Is that thing?
Can't complain
Yeah. No, I very
because
much.
this may be a good answer.
No, I very much like that question because I don't know if you come from legal studies. No, it's okay. No, I'm I spent part of my life defending that idea. I mean, normal citizens try to think that the law is only something that punishes and limits my freedom. Meanwhile, the law is very much present in our lives. And it looks for transforming society in one way or another, in orientating the behavior of the people in one way or another, right? So I always say the criminal code, the criminal law is something. I very much, for example, believe that the law can do many things here in terms of anti-gender hate speech, not only making it a crime, but having a much more role to guarantee which are the fundamental rights at stake. The victims of this anti-gender hate speech do not want the perpetrators to go to prison. They don't care. The only thing they ask is, I want that violence to stop. I want to have my rights. I want to be present on the social networks. I want to recover my life, the life I had before those attacks. That will be something done by the law. If someone is attacking me on the internet and I can ask, please, that violence to be stopped on the grounds of my human rights, not because it's a crime, and I can ask the governments or the companies that have, the property over those social platforms, I want the same human rights that the other uses, and you have the obligation to guarantee my human rights. Not precisely to put that person in prison, because sometimes it's impossible. It's impossible to identify the perpetrators on the internet, on the social platforms. So I very much believe in that.
Can I just add something
Yeah.
to Daniel's question? How optimistic are women?
Yeah. I don't know. It's up to them. It's up to them. Yeah, I very much think so. But I think, we have made a lot of improvements in that sense in the past decades. If I'm using some of these laws as an indicator of this evolution in a good sense, you have to think that only 20 years ago, that for them is a lot, but for us it's not that much. 20 years ago, there was not any single law, piece of legislation that was officially recognizing violence against women. They were talking about domestic violence, family violence, or things like that. So I think in that sense, it can be also there can be some evolution, or some of them are pointing things as, understanding gender violence in a more broad sense, included violence against LGBTQ community, and that is also violence, not only discrimination, but violence. That's a step forward that I think young generation are more aware. At least I have children of your age and also my students, that they question many times. They question my sexual dichotomy, and they say, what, Mom, you're saying he's a boy or a girl? Who knows, Maybe he's, how do you say in English? When you're, fluting, Mom, I'm like, and those categories are really new for me, and I think the next generation will have a much better idea to change those things, and they are very aware the importance of this digital context as one of the most important aspects and context of their lives. So they will claim for an action for their governments. They will claim for something to be done there, I think. Yeah. Two things, yeah. In many countries, there have been attempts to include, for example, in the compulsory curriculum at primary school or secondary school, to have a minimum content on gender equality, gender diversity, gender violence, these basic things, as you were saying, that it will be part of your socialization in those values. Some countries succeed in including those contents in the compulsory curriculum, but in many other countries, they did not success because in many countries, part of the population and the families and parents are against those type of education because they claim that is against the rights of the parents to raise their children in the way they want. And legally speaking, that is very much connected to the freedom of religion in many countries. As it was, for example, the case in Spain. Some years ago, we had a course, a subject that it was compulsory in high school, I think, that it was education for the citizenship, where there was very general content. I mean, it was explained how is a democracy, how is the rule of law, that we are a monarchy, and also which are the human rights, and that some human rights deal with gender equality and things like that. But then there was a whole movement that made that subject illegal because it was considered against the right of the parents to raise their children as they want, very much connected to the freedom of religion. That is, for example, the case in the States. In the States, it is forbidden to include any type of education on sexual and reproductive rights in the compulsory CB. Why? Because they consider that that will go against the freedom of religion of the parents. And in many countries, it's also said by this anti-gender movement that to talk about gender at schools, it is a type of propaganda, that it is, brainwashing our children in one way or another, right? So it is quite complicated to, have it legally compulsory or imposed by any law to receive that type of education.
We have a very handy clock here that tells us it's 2:17, so I did promise that we would finish today at 2:15. Thanks for all your questions. Thanks for attending. You may just have time now to get a coffee before going into your final class of ethics with Xavi, who's here on the third row. So with your permission, we'll give the students 20-25 minutes. 2:45. They'll be there. Thanks once again, everybody, for coming, and thanks to Dr. Igareda for her conference and for answering your questions.